The rhythms of Etruscan public life pulsed to the cadence of an elaborate ceremonial calendar that structured the year through recurring festivals, games, and communal celebrations that bound society together and marked the passage of seasons and agricultural cycles. The Etruscan calendar, inherited from astronomical observations and refined through generations of careful observation, divided the year into distinct periods, each associated with specific public ceremonies that gathered the urban population in collective experiences designed to reinforce social bonds, display civic wealth, and demonstrate the proper ordering of the community. These were not private devotional practices, but spectacular public performances, theatrical productions in the truest sense, where society literally staged itself and performed its own internal hierarchies and values before assembled crowds. The Spring New Year, celebrated in March, according to Etruscan reckoning, initiated a comprehensive cycle of purification, rituals, and renewal ceremonies that prepared the community psychologically and socially for the agricultural season ahead. These inaugural celebrations established a template of structured performance that would characterize Etruscan civic life throughout the year, with each major seasonal transition marked by processions, animal sacrifices, communal feasting, and athletic competition. The harvest festivals, particularly those honoring Fuplins, the deity associated with vegetation and agricultural abundance, transformed Etruscan cities into scenes of vibrant public celebration, where thousands of citizens and slaves moved through the streets in elaborate processions depicted in tomb paintings that preserve the visual memory of these occasions. Contemporary observers noted that these Etruscan harvest celebrations were characterized by an exuberance and sensory intensity that distinguished them from the more austere and formal ceremonies of neighboring cultures. Processions wound through city streets lined with crowds, with musicians leading the way while carried offerings of produce, wine, and livestock moved toward designated temple spaces where ritualists would perform the formal acts of sacrifice and supplication that the occasion demanded. The organization of these processions reflected the careful hierarchical structuring of society, with participants arranged by social rank and family affiliation, ensuring that the public spectacle itself became a demonstration of the social order and one's place within it. Merchants, artisans, agricultural workers, and enslaved populations all occupied their assigned positions within the ceremonial apparatus, each category of person visible and acknowledged as a component part of the integrated whole. Athletic competition formed perhaps the most celebrated and participatory dimension of Etruscan public culture, with games and contests appearing regularly throughout the ceremonial calendar and drawing vast audiences to designated athletic spaces within cities or in specialized venues constructed for sporting events. The Etruscans demonstrated a remarkable sophistication in their development of athletic infrastructure, constructing specialized facilities that accommodated both competitors and spectators, with permanent or semi-permanent structures designed specifically for chariot racing, foot races, wrestling, boxing, and other competitive events. Chariot racing achieved particular prominence in Etruscan athletic culture, becoming the signature sport that drew enthusiastic participation from the aristocratic elite and commanded passionate attention from crowds whose loyalty to particular toiled. It's a loyalty's coiled, it's a loyalty and peels. It is fiends of its card, it is semiskin. When it is part, it's but and without it is there that with the two. If to it with the to with the two, the with the though it the races themselves unfolded as spectacular performances, with richly decorated chariots drawn by carefully trained horses, drivers dressed in distinctive garments and colors that identified their team affiliations, and crowds arranged in viewing areas organized by social status. The commemoration of athletic victories in art and monumental display signals that successful athletes achieved significant status and social elevation through their competitive achievements, much as later Roman athletes would become celebrated fluents, much as leches as leches leches as leches as leches leches as leches as exletials, and such as sats. It's land, side, sats. That's it's and but it's well, or, where, with a 10, with that, but what the seg would do with air would one with tut, what, Beyond chariot racing, Etruscan athletic culture encompassed a comprehensive repertoire of competitive forms that transformed public spaces into arenas of human struggle and physical display. Wrestling and boxing featured prominently in Etruscan games, with depictions in tomb art showing competitors engaged in intense combat, often supervised by officials who enforced rules and determined winners. These combat sports, far from being brutal exhibitions without structure or regulation, operated according to established protocols and rules that governed acceptable techniques and determined outcomes according to established procedures. These sporting contests served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided entertainment and public spectacle. They offered opportunities for young aristocratic males to display their physical prowess and competitive spirit. They reinforced the hierarchical status of spectator. They reinforced poignance, vacatator, bantaporte, Bishan corns connets and points is cat. One, what is it? It is it's born, but it's been but, there's a war. Yes, to that do work, we'll have what if to have to wear, whatever, with or what, with work, swore, go, stuck up, but stuck, this is what it's and they created celebrated champions whose victories could elevate family prestige and social standing across generations. The construction of permanent sporting facilities and the regular scheduling of athletic events demonstrate that these were not occasional amusements but fundamental institutions of Etruscan civic culture embedded in the ceremonial calendar and the operation of urban society. Foot races and jumping competitions rounded out the athletic repertoire available to Etruscan competitors and audiences. With these events drawing participants from across the Confederation and creating opportunities for individual athletes to achieve renown and status through victory. The organization of these athletic competitions reveals sophisticated understanding of spectacle management and crowd control. With officials designated to judge competitions fairly, enforce rules, and determine victors according to established protocols. The prizes awarded to successful competitors, documented in inscriptions and artistic depictions, ranged from material rewards of considerable value to public honors and commemorations that secured lasting fame and social elevation. Victorious athletes became celebrated public figures whose achievements were memorialized in art and whose names were transmitted across generations through the records of competition, victories, and the acclaim of their communities. This athletic culture, which so impressed and influenced the Romans who absorbed Etruscan sporting traditions into their own civilization, represents a critical component of Etruscan social life and public performance. Music and dance constituted equally essential dimensions of Etruscan public culture, serving as the accompaniment to virtually every significant social occasion and ceremonial event that brought the community together. The double flute, or aulos, emerged as the signature Etruscan instrument, appearing frequently in tomb frescoes and artistic representations where musicians are depicted performing at banquets, funeral processions, athletic competitions, and religious ceremonies. The distinctive sound of the paired pipes, one for melody and one for accompaniment or rhythmic drone, created the auditory backdrop for much of Etruscan public life, and contemporary observers noted that Etruscans seemed to move through their social world in constant accompaniment of musical performance. The lyre, borrowed from Greek tradition but adapted to Etruscan preferences and performance styles, provided another crucial musical element, appearing in the hands of professional musicians and aristocratic amateurs and elitocratic amateurs and aristocratic amatrates, aristocratic, recidocratian, musicrens fricanic, that is ritzcrap that, it is since quart king, but it's but, it, we will, I heard, what the poor have what the well, what the The salpinx, a bronze trumpet used for signaling and ceremonial announcement, conveyed authority and commanded attention at public gatherings, military assemblies, and important civic moments. The performers themselves, typically enslaved or of humble origin, though sometimes freeborn professionals, achieved a curious status as essential participants in elite social life, despite their social subordination. They appeared in domestic contexts, performing for the entertainment of aristocratic households. They led processions and public ceremonies. They provided accompaniment for athletic competitions, and they were essential components of funerary spectacles that honored the dead. The tomb frescoes preserve images of musicians dressed in distinctive garments, often shown with distinctive physical characteristics that mark them as professional performers, their bodies and faces identifiable as those who spent their lives in musical practice and public performance. These artistic representations provide invaluable evidence about performance styles, instrument construction, and the integration of music into virtually every significant social occasion in Etruscan civilization. Dancing, intimately connected to musical performance and featuring prominently in tomb paintings and sculptural representations, provides insight into Etruscan physical culture and the aesthetic values of bodily movement and expression. The depictions show dancers engaged in elaborate choreographies, moving with fluid grace and dynamic energy that conveys professional skill and long training. Both male and female dancers appear in these representations, sometimes performing before elite audiences, sometimes participating in ceremonial contexts, and sometimes engaged in what ancient observers perceived as uninhibited movement and provocative display. The remarkable freedom with which Etruscan society permitted female dancers to perform publicly, displaying their bodies through movement and participating in ceremonial activities with suitably scandalized through meeting and participating is scandalized exobranist scandalize, candelides, condable that convendicesters, convasitutant, that is axer to whip to buit him, but, the but, with the heart, at the with the but, the put wall, it with what that with our cool, Yet among the Etruscans, this public participation in music and dance appears to have been consistent with broader patterns of female social integration and public prominence. The great banquets that featured throughout Etruscan aristocratic life represented perhaps the most elaborate and carefully orchestrated of all Etruscan public performances, bringing together music, dance, food, drink, and social hierarchy in elaborate ceremonial displays that consumed vast resources and demonstrated the wealth and status of host families. According to Greek observers who documented these events with fascination and disapproval, the Etruscan banquet could extend for hours, with multiple courses of elaborately prepared food accompanied by fine wines served in precious vessels by attendants in livery. The participants reclined on cushioned couches, arranged around tables laden with delicacies, a dining posture and practice borrowed from Greek models, but transformed through Etruscan elaboration and the distinctive practice of including women as equal participants in the banqueting experience. The inclusion of women in these public social events distinguished Etruscan practice from both Greek and Roman customs, where respectable women were excluded from the male-dominated world of formal dining and public sociability. This integration of women into elite social occasions, particularly during the classical and Hellenistic periods of Etruscan civilization, roughly 600 to 340 BCE, represented one of the most distinctive and remarked upon features of Etruscan society that would ultimately be transformed and restricted as Roman cultural practices became dominant. The walls of Etruscan tombs, particularly those in Tarquinia's Monterazzi necropolis, preserve exquisite fresco paintings depicting these elaborate banquets in vivid detail, with multiple courses of food, musicians performing, attendants serving wine, and guests engaged in animated conversation and entertainment. These painted scenes are not merely decorative embellishments, but serve as visual documentation of actual social practices and the material culture that structured elite life. The careful attention to detail in rendering clothing, jewelry, hairstyles, and facial features provides ethnographic data about actual Etruscan appearance and fashion, while the compositional arrangements and hierarchical positioning of figures within the scenes communicate implicit messages about social order and relationships. The prominence of coupled figures in many of these scenes. The prominence of couples is the prominence with husbands, with his scenes, with husbands, with physicians, positions to accretion, pornis. Connebrations, cornices, condorations, coordinations, or aneborederants, and the bodits quad, norns, it is stinctual, and what to quad, sigh, cupid, kawit, but, bad, but that one, quen, or there, and what, it's if that is then do, with that, what, it what it's good to do. What, on there, Botanical flourishing in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE emerged as one of the most celebrated figures in Etruscan history, precisely because she moved with confidence through elite political and social spaces during the critical period when Etruscan kings governed Rome, participating in decision-making and wielding considerable influence through her intelligence, strategic acumen, and social standing. According to historical sources, preserved by later Roman authors, Tanacle demonstrated political awareness and divination expertise, receiving omens that predicted the ascendancy of her husband Lucamo, who would become known as Lucius Tarquinius Priscus and would rule Rome as one of its most significant early kings. Her ability to appear publicly, her opinions, her indulgence, own prudence Leo, and product its own pronities, own prinity, and pertilituli and pertilitulus in Italico and Italian panicular. It's indilia, initiator, insituature, inature, to it to chug, institute, it's pora, in its buying in bud, it's important, on to it, it to it to when with here we will say, if there, with we will, before we will, with with the war with The traditions preserving her memory, even into the later Roman imperial period, attest to the enduring significance of her life and achievements. Even as Roman authors reshaped and sometimes distorted her legacy for their own narratives, they nonetheless preserved evidence of her political importance and autonomous agency. Velia Spurinna, living in the later phases of Etruscan history, represented another towering female figure of political prominence who exercised significant authority despite the progressive Romanization of Etruscan territories that was restricting female autonomy and subordinating women to Roman cultural norms. Her prominence during the transition period between Etruscan independence and Roman dominance, roughly the 4th to 3rd centuries BCE, demonstrates that exceptional women could exercise significant authority and influence in Etruscan society, even as political conditions were fundamentally transforming, wielding power in ways foreclosed to their counterparts in other Mediterranean civilizations. The documentation of her achievements in surviving inscriptions and historical accounts provides evidence that aristocratic Etruscan women maintained access to power and authority even as their civilization underwent authority even as their civilization underlizates. In authorities settlers sandis. It is sty, was, sans it's out, that bends, that bits in, but it's bets it's wood but, with what, it's, if it though, do, if it is with the two, though, what, the, or what, us, Her life and achievements stand as testimony to the resilience of Etruscan cultural patterns around female autonomy even under conditions of external pressure and political conquest. The material culture surrounding Etruscan female life, as preserved in archaeological remains from tombs and domestic contexts, reveals sophisticated consumer aesthetics and access to luxury goods that signaled elevated status. The elaborate jewelry recovered from elite female burials, gold fibulae, intricate necklaces, earrings fashioned with remarkable technical skill indicates both the wealth available to aristocratic women and the value placed on personal adornment and display as markers of social position. The mirrors, some engraved with scenes of significance and crafted from highly polished bronze, provided not merely functional objects but luxurious possessions that combined practical utility with artistic achievement. The containers for cosmetics and perfumed oils, fashioned from ivory, alabaster, and precious stones, demonstrate the development of sophisticated beauty practices among Etruscan women and the availability of luxury goods that supported elaborate grooming and personal care regimens. These material remains preserve the physical traces of an elite female life, markedly more visible, autonomous, and publicly engaged than that of women in neighboring civilizations. The evolution of women's status across the long span of Etruscan civilization reveals important transitions in social organization and gender relations that responded to broader historical changes and external influences. During the earliest Villanovan period, when Etruscan civilization was still in its formative phases, archaeological evidence suggests a relatively egalitarian partnership between men and women, with grave goods indicating gender-specific roles, yet without marked hierarchy or dominance. As Etruscan civilization developed and wealth accumulated in the hands of hereditary aristocratic families between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, women of elite status gained increasing prominence and autonomy. Their wealth and property holdings documented in burial assemblages that matched those of elite males in richness and value. The Orientalizing period, when contact with Greek civilization and Pelcharis, the Orientalize and Culturis, civilization pluralization of lealization, inituards, Laertive natues, rhetoritation, yet the actual, yet os, but the actual and yet atu, eschwit the catual, prat to pierce the wit to the predit, it but bun bat but well, of but, well, and well has a and a word, we to do, well, with the, with to fa, with work, with the tsula, By the archaic and classical periods, the evidence in tomb frescoes and funerary sculpture shows women reclining at banquets beside their husbands, attending athletic competitions, dancing at public events, and participating in ceremonial processions with a public visibility and social integration that Greek observers found shocking and immoral. The gradual Romanization of Etruscan territory, beginning systematically around the 4th century BCE, and accelerating through the 3rd century as Roman military conquest extended across central Italy, brought profound changes in women's status and social possibilities. As Etruscan political autonomy disappeared and their territory was absorbed into the expanding Roman state following the final conquest of Etruscan cities, aristocratic Etruscan women experienced progressive loss of the freedoms and authority they had previously enjoyed. The onomastic evidence preserved in inscriptions shows the transition vividly. The practice of Etruscan women retaining their birth names and transmitting matrilineal identity even after marriage gave way to the Roman practice of women taking feminized versions of their husbands' family names. Visible shifts in naming conventions that marked the impositions of patriarchal Roman systems on market visible sizable, Barchiarchator, Morlicararchus Simson Bari. Since that cinches it but with it to but with but of as a with of a what did what the well and I took to require out at the to the work what to what go what what Yet the influence did not flow entirely in one direction. Some features of Etruscan female autonomy appear to have influenced the development of Roman aristocratic women's status, with figures like Livia, the wife of Augustus, ruling 27 BCE, 214 CE, exercising political influence and advisory authority that would have been difficult for earlier Roman women but showed clear continuities with Etruscan models of female power. The role of aristocratic elites in maintaining and perpetuating pagan cultural systems cannot be overstated, as these individuals functioned not merely as political leaders but as custodians of civic knowledge and cultural expertise. In ancient Rome, the patrician class maintained their authority partly through their exclusive knowledge of religious procedures and calendar calculations. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, was invariably a member of the aristocratic elite, and his role encompassed not only ceremonial duties but also the maintenance of the official calendar, the determination of auspicious days for public business, and the adjudication of disputes regarding civic procedure. This concentration of specialized knowledge in aristocratic hands created a systematic mechanism for social stratification. The common people required the services of educated elites to navigate the complex web of civic obligations, calendar constraints, and procedural requirements that structured public life. A plebeian could not simply decide to hold an assembly or conduct a market transaction on any day. These activities required consultation with those who understood the civic calendar and its requirements. The priesthoods of ancient pagan civilizations, far from being purely religious institutions, functioned as essential administrative structures that organized labor, managed resources, and coordinated collective action. In Sumerian civilization, temple complexes served as economic powerhouses that organized agricultural production, managed irrigation systems, and controlled trade networks. Thousands of clay tablets record the administrative activities of temple bureaucrats who assigned workers to fields, calculated harvest yields, recorded transactions, and maintained accounts. These temple administrators were not mystics or spiritual leaders in any meaningful sense. They were accountants, engineers, and managers who happened to work within institutions that also maintained ritual components. The temple's sacred dimension and its administrative function were inextricably intertwined, with the sacred calendar justifying the periodic mobilization of labor for temple projects, while the administrative competence of priesthoods justified their authority over community resources. The education systems of ancient pagan civilizations reveal how cultural transmission operated as a fundamental mechanism for maintaining social order and transmitting civic values across generations. In Rome, aristocratic families maintained networks of patronage and mentorship through which young males learned the skills necessary for public life, rhetoric, law, military tactics, and the intricate knowledge of civic procedure. This apprenticeship system was formalized in the institution of terrazinium fore, a sort of mandatory internship in which young men of elite families spent months or years accompanying senior politicians and orators, learning by observation and gradual participation. The knowledge transmitted through these apprenticeships was entirely practical and civic in character. How to speak effectively in the Senate, how to interpret omens in ways that supported or opposed particular political decisions, how to navigate the complex network of reciprocal obligations that bound Roman society together. Schools in Rome, which became more common in the imperial period, followed a similar pattern, teaching young people not abstract philosophy, but the practical skills and cultural knowledge necessary for functioning in society. The Greek gymnasium represented an even more comprehensive educational institution, one that integrated physical training, intellectual education, and socialization into a unified system. Young male Athenians spent significant portions of their youth in gymnasia, supervised by professional educators called padutrabai, engaging in athletic competition while also receiving instruction in music, poetry, and basic mathematics. However, the gymnasium was not merely an educational facility, but a crucial site for the socialization and integration of young men into the civic community. The sight of young male bodies training in nude athletic competition was a common theme in Greek art and literature, but this public display of youth served important civic functions. It allowed fathers and potential mentors to observe and assess the character of young men. It created opportunities for bonding between elite youth and established leaders, and it embodied important Greek cultural values regarding the human body, physical excellence, and the connection between bodily discipline and civic virtue. When a young Athenian completed his gymnasium education and underwent the rituals of initiation into his deme or local neighborhood, he was not merely graduating from a school, but being formally integrated into the civic community as someone who had mastered the physical, intellectual, and social skills necessary for participation in democratic politics. Gender roles within ancient pagan social systems were rigorously defined and maintained through cultural practices, civic procedures, and everyday social interactions. In Athens, the exclusion of women from the public sphere was not incidental to democracy, but fundamental to its structure. Public assembly, military service, and participation in the agora were restricted to free adult males, while women of citizen status were confined to domestic roles. Though their status as wives of citizens gave them certain privileges that the enslaved and foreign populations did not possess, Roman women enjoyed somewhat greater legal privileges than their Greek counterparts, able to own property and conduct business independently in many cases, yet they remained excluded from military service and formal political office. However, elite Roman women exercised significant informal political influence through their relationships with powerful men and through their roles as managers of great households. This gender differentiation was maintained through everyday social practices and formal legal restrictions, but also through cultural narratives, artistic representations, and the organization of public space. The layout of Roman homes, with the atrium at the center where the paterfamilias conducted business and received clients, and the interior rooms where women spent much of their time, physically embodied and reinforced gender hierarchies. The legal systems of ancient pagan societies were inextricably connected to their religious and civic calendars, making law itself a manifestation of pagan cultural frameworks. In Rome, No legal proceedings could occur on days designated as dies nefasti, unlucky days, of which there were numerous throughout the calendar. This created a legal rhythm that aligned the administration of justice with the civic calendar. Furthermore, the oaths taken by witnesses and parties in legal proceedings were not merely assurances of truthfulness, but invocations of the community itself, swearing before the assembled people that one spoke truth. Perjury was not merely a civil matter, but a violation of the social bond itself, considered a contamination of the entire community. When the Romans spoke of someone being exiled from the city, they did not only mean physical expulsion, but exclusion from all civic institutions and relationships. The person became a non-citizen in their own homeland. This extreme punishment reveals the extent to which participation in the pagan civic system was considered the essence of civilization itself. To be excluded from the civic calendar, the civic festivals, and the civic ceremonies was to be effectively dead to society. Military organization in ancient pagan civilizations demonstrates how thoroughly pagan cultural systems extended into even the most martial dimensions of state activity. Roman military campaigns invariably began with elaborate sacrificial ceremonies in which senior commanders sought omens by examining animal entrails, determining whether the gods would favor the military venture. These practices were not separate from military planning, but integral to it. Generals could not risk public opinion by ignoring unfavorable omens, and soldiers' morale was significantly affected by whether their commanders reported favorable or unfavorable auspices. The ritual of the triumph, the ceremonial return of a victorious general to Rome, involved elaborate processions that moved through the city in prescribed patterns, with the general dressed in the garments of Jupiter, acknowledging that military victory itself was understood through the framework of pagan civic culture. When a general rode in triumph through Rome, he was not merely celebrating a personal military success, but performing a civic ritual that reintegrated military conquest into the community's collective memory and identity. Trade and economic exchange in pagan civilizations were similarly structured by cultural practices and social conventions that operated within the framework of civic systems. Greek pottery found at archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean testifies to extensive trade networks that operated according to established patterns and customary practices. Merchants who traded with Greek cities learned to produce artifacts in Greek styles and to participate in Greek-style markets, adapting their practices to Greek commercial customs. The agora in Greek cities was not merely a marketplace, but a regulated civic space where transactions occurred under the supervision of officials called agoranomoi, who maintained standards for weights and measures, prevented fraud, and ensured that market activities occurred in an orderly manner. This regulation was justified not as a practical necessity, but as part of maintaining proper civic order. Similarly, Roman markets were associated with particular deities and operated according to established calendrical patterns. The Mercurials market was associated with Mercury, the god of commerce, and specific days of the week were designated for particular types of transactions. The concept of debt and credit in pagan societies operated within a social and cultural framework that made economic transactions inseparable from civic relationships. In Rome, the practice of patronage created networks of reciprocal obligation that extended far beyond purely economic exchange. A patron provided financial support, legal protection, and political advocacy to his clients, while the clients reciprocated with labor, loyalty, and public support. These relationships were simultaneously economic transactions, legal arrangements, and moral commitments. A client who failed to support his patron politically faced not merely economic loss, but social ostracism and damage to his reputation. The moral and social dimensions of economic exchange were inseparable from the practical and material dimensions, making the study of ancient pagan economics inseparable from the study of their social and cultural systems. Public works projects in pagan civilizations reveal how communal labor was organized and how communities understood their collective responsibilities. The construction of the Parthenon in Athens involved not merely the labor of paid workers, but also the symbolic participation of the entire citizen body in creating a monument to collective achievement. Citizens voted to approve the project. Aristocrats provided funds to compete for the honor of sponsorship, and common laborers participated in the actual construction. The resulting building stood as a physical manifestation of Athenian collective power and cultural achievement. Roman aqueducts, bridges, and roads similarly represented projects of such scale and complexity that they could only be accomplished through the coordinated labor of vast populations under centralized direction. The Augustus peace that followed the civil wars of the late Republic allowed such projects to flourish, with emperors commissioning massive public works that served both practical purposes and the symbolic function of displaying imperial magnificence. These projects were often connected to commemorative purposes, aqueducts and roads named after emperors or generals, creating permanent monuments to their achievements that citizens encountered in their daily lives. The role of entertainment and public spectacle in maintaining pagan civic systems cannot be underestimated, as these activities served not merely as diversions, but as crucial mechanisms for social cohesion and the transmission of cultural values. Roman gladiatorial games, often misunderstood as mere entertainment, functioned as sophisticated expressions of Roman military culture and social hierarchy. The games required the participation of the magistrate who sponsored them, the crowds who attended and cheered, the condemned criminals or prisoners of war whose deaths were witnessed, and the architects and engineers who designed the amphitheaters where the games occurred. The emperor's role in the games, particularly his presence in a specially designated box and his ability to spare or condemn participants through the gesture of his hand, served as a constant visual reminder of the imperial hierarchy. Similarly, Greek dramatic festivals served to educate audiences about civic values and historical events. The great tragedies performed at the Festival of Dionysus explored themes of political authority, family obligation, and the proper relationship between individual desire and civic duty. Attendance at these festivals was effectively mandatory for citizens, making dramatic performance a form of civic education that conveyed important cultural messages in emotionally compelling forms. The spatial organization of ancient pagan cities embodied their cultural systems in physical form, creating environments that guided behavior and reinforced social hierarchies. The Roman Forum was designed so that movement through it followed prescribed paths that brought citizens past temples, monuments to past generals, and administrative buildings, creating a kind of architectural narrative that citizens encountered daily. The layout of the city physically enacted the social order, with temples of Jupiter positioned on high ground, symbolically dominating the city, with the homes of aristocrats located in prestigious neighborhoods, and with the dwellings of the poor and enslaved confined to crowded, lower-lying areas. This spatial organization was not merely a practical consequence of geography and resources, but a deliberate expression of social hierarchy that was experienced constantly by inhabitants. Every time a person climbed the hill to visit a temple or walked through the forum, they navigated a landscape that physically embodied their society's values and social structure. The civilizations of the ancient Near East developed pagan cultural systems that, while distinct from Greek and Roman models in important respects, similarly created comprehensive frameworks for organizing urban communities and maintaining social cohesion. Ancient Egypt, with its remarkably stable civilization spanning more than 3 millennia, provides a particularly revealing case study of how pagan culture functioned as the fundamental architecture of state organization. The Egyptian understanding of social order rested upon the concept of ma'at, often translated as harmony and balance, which was understood not as a spiritual principle but as the fundamental requirement for the functioning of society and the maintenance of its hierarchical structure. The pharaoh, positioned at the apex of this hierarchy, was responsible for maintaining Mat and all his public activities, the festivals he sponsored, the monuments he constructed, the legal decisions he promulgated were justified as expressions. The legal decisions he promulgated, the legally, It's Ligina, the legion is it closing with, it's reticence it don't if it, it's send it is its button but it's it but or then but with you what the that would do at what that would what I thought what was to go to this concept of order was not abstract but immediately practical and tangible. It meant that irrigation systems functioned properly, that taxes were collected equitably, that social roles were clearly defined and maintained, and that the community acknowledged the authority of established hierarchies. Egyptian festivals, known as Heb, functioned as crucial mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion across a vast and geographically dispersed kingdom. Between 45 and 60 festivals occurred annually, depending on the particular dynasty in power and the gods favored by the ruling king. These festivals were not scattered randomly throughout the year, but were carefully organized around the Egyptian agricultural calendar, with major festivals marking critical points in the agricultural cycle: the flooding of the Nile, the planting season, and the harvest. The Opet festival, celebrated annually at Thebes, exemplified this civic function. During Opet, the statues of the gods Amen, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in elaborate processions through the city, moving from the Temple of Karnak to the Temple of Luxor and back again. The procession itself involved thousands of priests, musicians, soldiers, and ordinary citizens, with different social classes participating in clearly designated roles and locations. While upper-class Egyptians might have access to the inner temple precincts, common people lined the streets to witness the passage of the divine statues, each social group acknowledging their position in the overall community hierarchy through their position relative to the moving statues. These festivals were not voluntary entertainment, but mandatory occasions during which normal economic activity ceased, allowing entire communities to participate collectively in civic rituals that reinforced social order and hierarchical relationships. The Egyptian priesthood functioned as the essential administrative machinery through which the pharaonic state maintained control over vast territories and diverse populations. Priests, serving in major temples, controlled vast estates and managed complex economic operations that sustained the state. The priesthood operated as an exclusive institutional elite, with religious knowledge kept secret and available only to those trained within the priestly system. However, this secrecy was not merely about maintaining esoteric spiritual doctrine, but about controlling crucial information regarding the agricultural calendar, astronomical observations necessary for predicting the timing of the Nile's annual flooding, and administrative procedures required for managing state resources. A peasant farmer needed to consult with priests or their representatives to understand when planting and harvesting should occur. A provincial governor required priestly knowledge to calculate taxes and organize the collection of grain for state storage. The monopoly on this specialized knowledge allowed the priesthood to maintain authority and justified their substantial share of the state's resources. The monumental architecture of ancient Egypt reveals in physical form the centrality of pagan civic institutions to state organization. The construction of temples, tombs, and other monuments required the sustained mobilization of vast quantities of labor, materials, and resources. The famous pyramids of the Old Kingdom were not merely burial monuments, but expressions of centralized state power and proof of the pharaoh's ability to command the resources of the entire kingdom. The construction of such monuments was possible only because the administrative systems embodied in pagan cultural practices allowed the state to collect taxes, mobilize labor, and organize supply chains across the kingdom. New kingdom temples, such as Karnak, grew over centuries through successive phases of construction, each phase representing the ambitions and resources of successive pharaohs and revealing through their scale and decoration the continuity of Egyptian civic culture across centuries. Workers who participated in constructing these monuments received compensation in the form of grain allocations, housing, and other necessities provided by state granaries whose operations were justified and legitimated through the framework of state religion and the pharaoh's responsibility to maintain a mated. Through the frameworks is the pharaoh's responsibility. It's responsing God with spons it's con. It is swats it is. It's mad. Is it is by on. But it's it. But's in but what it concept was what where at the it's a to do with at the what would was out at tuck what I got to what cool with other with our school was the Egyptian system of recording and scribal practice demonstrates how deeply pagan cultural systems extended into the mechanisms of state administration. Scribes formed an essential professional class whose education and training positioned them as intermediaries between the illiterate masses and the literate elite who controlled the state. The scribe's role was not merely to record information, but to participate in the interpretation and administration of state policy. Scribes recorded tax assessments, maintained records of grain storage, documented the assignment of labor to state projects, and kept accounts of all transactions involving state resources. The practice of writing itself, initially developed for administrative purposes rather than literary ones, was encoded with sacred significance and associated with the god Thoth, patron of scribes and wisdom. By the time of the New Kingdom, scribal education was formalized, with young men being trained in scribal schools attached to major temples and administrative centers. This training was not merely practical instruction in how to hold a brush and mix ink, but an initiation into a professional class whose specialized knowledge gave them status and authority. Young scribes learned not only writing techniques but also the conventions of administrative communication, the proper formats for various types of documents, and the procedural requirements for different categories of state business. The civilization of ancient Mesopotamia developed an equally distinctive pagan cultural system that functioned as a template for urban organization and state administration. The Sumerian city-states pioneered the model of temple-centered urban organization that would be adapted by successive Mesopotamian civilizations, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and others. In early Sumerian cities, the temple stood literally and figuratively at the center of urban life, dominating the city's physical landscape through its architecture and controlling the economic, political, and social life of the entire community. The temples functioned as the primary center for the storage and distribution of grain and other essential goods. Agricultural surpluses were collected from farmers working temple lands and stored in massive granaries associated with temples. These surpluses served multiple functions. They ensured the community could survive poor harvests or floods. They provided the resources to sustain the priestly bureaucracy and temple workers. They supplied the materials for trading expeditions that acquired raw materials unavailable locally, and they funded monumental construction projects that expressed community achievement and identity. The administration of these complex economic and identity, the administration of these administrations of the Vistrastrastum, and from this need, it evaluates to missions, initially, scrislil, initially, used to sislida, which it is singer, ten but, with it but it's good but, it but that, in there's it will where, what that then would wear, what the put will on, with what will with the, well, with the, well, what, go, but, the wood go, scope of a book and squid the ball, that would has, that was more, this works, got this, the Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between civic authority and divine sanction created a distinctive political theory that would influence subsequent civilizations, including Rome. Mesopotamian government was understood as serving the will of the gods, with the king acting as an intermediary between the divine realm and human society. This was not a mystical claim, but a practical political principle. It meant that the king's authority derived from his role in maintaining the temple system, sponsoring the festivals, and ensuring that the proper rituals were performed that the community believed necessary for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the success of agriculture. The elaborate government hierarchies that emerged in major Mesopotamian states, including prime ministers, judges, governors, military officers, scribes, and tax collectors, all operated within the framework of serving the god through the agency of the king. As Mesopotamian states grew larger and more complex, particularly during the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, the bureaucratic apparatus became increasingly elaborate, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Governance was justified through the framework of pagan civic religion. The Etruscan civilization of central Italy provides a particularly important example of how pagan civic systems could serve as a cultural template that later civilizations adapted and modified to suit their own circumstances. The Etruscans, who flourished from roughly the 8th to the 1st centuries before the Common Era, organized themselves as a federation of city-states, each with its own urban center featuring temples, markets, and residential areas arranged according to established patterns. Etruscan cities were planned according to religious principles, with temples positioned to command views of the city and to organize civic space according to sacred geometry. The Etruscans practiced divination techniques, such as augury, the interpretation of bird behavior to determine the god's will, and haruspicy, the interpretation of animal entrails, particularly from sacrificed animals. These practices were not merely private devotions, but state procedures. Before major civic decisions, Etruscan magistrates consulted professional diviners to determine whether the gods approved of proposed actions. These divination practices had political importance because they provided a mechanism through which elite leaders could delay or prevent actions they opposed. A magistrate who wished to block a colleague's proposal could commission a diviner to interpret an unfavorable omen, and such interpretations could not easily be disputed. The most significant historical importance of Etruscan pagan civilization lies in its profound influence on early Roman culture. As Rome expanded and conquered Etruscan city-states during the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, Roman elites adopted many Etruscan cultural practices and incorporated them into Roman civic systems. Haruspicy, the Etruscan practice of examining animal entrails to determine divine will, became a central practice in Roman state religion, with professional haruspices being consulted by the Roman Senate on matters of civic importance. The Roman institution of augury, in which magistrates interpreted signs, particularly the flight of birds, to determine whether the gods approved of civic activities, derived directly from Etruscan models. Etruscan architectural traditions, particularly their use of the arched vault and their approach to urban planning, influenced the development of Roman building techniques and city design. Even the iconic symbol of Roman authority, the Phaza bundle of rods carried before magistrates to signify their authority, derived from Etruscan practice. The early Roman kings, some of whom were Etruscan or of Etruscan descent, imported wholesale the administrative structures, religious practices, and cultural conventions of Etruscan civilization, establishing patterns that would persist and develop throughout the subsequent centuries of Roman history. The development of written codes of law in various pagan civilizations reveals how deeply legal systems were integrated into their religious and civic frameworks. The famous Code of Hammurabi, created by the Babylonian king Hammurabi around 1750, before the Common Era, exemplifies this integration. The code opened with a preamble in which the king claimed that the god Shamash, associated with justice, had given him the authority to create laws and maintain justice. The laws themselves addressed a full range of human activity, commercial transactions, marriage, debt, wages for various professions, compensation for injuries, and punishment for crimes. However, the penalties prescribed varied radically depending on the social status of the person committing the crime and the social status of the victim. The law explicitly acknowledged different social strata and prescribed different penalties for identical offenses, depending on whether the person was a member of the elite, a common person, or enslaved. This systematic differentiation reveals how pagan civic systems did not merely organize society, but actively worked to maintain and perpetuate hierarchical social structures that were understood as divinely ordained and necessary for the proper functioning of civilization. The role of scribal professions in maintaining pagan administrative systems cannot be overemphasized, as these specialists formed the connective tissue between elite leadership and the broader population. In Mesopotamian civilizations, scribal training was formalized and formidable, requiring years of study to master the complex cuneiform writing system. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive from Mesopotamian cities, the vast majority of which are administrative documents recording transactions, assignments of labor, accounts of goods received and dispersed, and records of legal proceedings. These documents reveal the existence of bureaucratic systems of remarkable sophistication, with layers of administrative oversight, record-keeping procedures that allowed for verification and auditing of transactions, and systematic procedures for adjudicating disputes. The maintenance of such systems required a large professional class of scribes who spent their entire careers becoming expert in the technicalities of administration. Young men seeking entry into this profession underwent formal training in scribal schools, learning not only writing but also mathematics, legal procedures, and the technical requirements of various administrative tasks. The integration of agriculture and astronomical observation into pagan civic systems reveals how these systems created comprehensive knowledge frameworks that allowed civilizations to function effectively. Despite limited technological resources, Egyptian priests maintained careful astronomical observations, watching the movements of stars and planets and correlating these movements with seasonal changes. The heliacal rising of the star Sirius, called Sothis by the Egyptians, occurred annually just before the Nile's inundation, and priests used this astronomical event as a marker for timing agricultural activities. This knowledge was not pure science, but was encoded within religious and ceremonial frameworks. The flooding of the Nile was understood through religious narratives about the god Osiris and the tears of the goddess Isis. But the practical value of these narratives lay in their role in organizing the community's understanding of the annual agricultural cycle. Mesopotamian astronomers similarly developed sophisticated knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies, and this knowledge was essential for calculating the lengths of months and maintaining an accurate calendar that would keep religious festivals aligned with the seasons. The priests who maintained this knowledge thereby maintained control over the calendar itself, controlling when festivals occurred and when economic activities were permitted. The vast Persian Achaemenid Empire, which at its height stretched from the Indus Valley to Egypt and encompassed dozens of distinct peoples and cultural traditions, provides perhaps the most compelling example of how pagan civic systems could be adapted and applied across immense territories to create unified administrative frameworks capable of governing unprecedented diversity. The architects of this empire, particularly the early Achaemenid rulers Cyrus the Great and later Darius the Great, confronted a problem fundamentally different from that faced by the Greek city-states or the Italian peninsula: how to govern an empire so vast that no single administrative center could directly control all distant regions. Their solution was not to impose a uniform pagan cultural system wholesale, but to adapt and modify the pre-existing administrative systems of conquered territories, incorporating them, immersing in ministry, bisting in zeratori, incorporating, incorporar, uncoworks, or enforcing, or enforcing, forcing warlord, to enforcing, poor, but import, but therefore, or, wedo. That with that or but or well Well, oh, what the, what, oh, whoa, what the, does, what, was, well, what was, to the walls, the girl, but I did the book, the world was, just, this approach reveals a sophisticated understanding of how pagan administrative systems functioned. They were flexible frameworks capable of accommodation and adaptation rather than rigid systems that required complete uniformity. The satrapy system that formed the backbone of Persian imperial administration embodied this principle of maintaining diversity within unity. The vast empire was divided into between 20 and 30 satrapies, major administrative units typically organized on geographical basis, each governed by a satrap appointed by the king. Below the satrap, a general supervised military recruitment and maintained order, while a state secretary kept the official records. The general and secretary reported both to the satrap and directly to the central government, creating overlapping lines of authority that prevented any single regional administrator from accumulating too much independent power. This distributed administrative system functioned through extensive bureaucratic procedures documented in thousands of surviving cuneiform tablets discovered at Persepolis, the imperial capital. These administrative records reveal a sophisticated system for tracking the movement of goods, the assignment of labor, and the collection of tribute from subject territories. The system operated according to standardized procedures and recorded transactions in ways that allowed imperial officials to audit and verify that local officials were carrying out their duties correctly. Critically, the Achaemenids recognized that the most effective approach to governing conquered territories was not to overturn existing administrative structures, but to retain the officials and procedures already in place in subjugated lands while subordinating them to Persian imperial authority. The religious dimensions of Persian administration operated similarly to other pagan systems, but with distinctive characteristics shaped by Persian cosmology and political traditions. Rather than replacing the religious practices and priestly classes of conquered peoples, the Achaemenids typically allowed local religious systems to continue, often positioning themselves as supporters and sponsors of local temples and cults. This accommodation of local religious practices served multiple functions. It prevented the alienation of conquered populations who might have resisted if their traditional practices were suppressed. It allowed Persian rulers to identify themselves with local power structures and cultural traditions, and it preserved the administrative expertise embodied in local priestly classes and temple systems. The Persian king claimed divine sanction for his rule through his rule as maintainer of his rule. As a party, opposing as departing options of his rule, adopting Phragians adopteries, adopting Coptans as adoptedic, Sinoports, boarding as aditants, poptilec, it's it done. It is it's it bun, but it bun, but it's it bun, but it is more. What it does if it would, if they want that, well, if they were to, well, if we will, we do it, some stuff for the wars, An Egyptian temple official would understand the Persian king's authority in terms of the Egyptian concept of Mat and the pharaonic role in maintaining cosmic order, while a Mesopotamian provincial governor would understand the king's authority through Mesopotamian concepts of divine sanction for the king's rule. This flexibility in justifying authority through locally comprehensible frameworks allowed Persian rule to rest on a foundation of diverse but compatible pagan civic systems. The expansion of Greek civilization following the conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent establishment of Hellenistic kingdoms provides another crucial example of how pagan cultural systems functioned as transferable templates for organizing civilization. As Alexander's armies conquered territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean and into Asia, Greek soldiers, officials, and settlers migrated into these newly conquered regions, bringing with them Greek cultural practices and urban organizational patterns. The creation of numerous new cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, but including Antioch in Syria, Seleucia on the Tigris in Mesopotamia, and dozens of others, allowed Greek urban culture to establish itself in conquered territories. These Hellenistic cities were not constructed randomly, but were planned according to the principles of Greek urban design, most notably the Hippodamian grid plan, in which streets intersected at right angles, creating regular city blocks. The Hippodamian system represented far more than an aesthetic preference. It embodied Greek principles of rational organization and orderly civic space. Hellenistic city planners adapted this basic grid pattern to varied topography through terracing and retaining walls, maintaining the fundamental principle of rational grid organization even in cities built on hillsides. The incorporation of monumental public spaces, sanctuaries, and administrative buildings into the center of these cities followed Greek patterns that had developed over centuries in Greek city-states. The Hellenistic cities served as vehicles for spreading Greek pagan civic systems throughout the conquered territories. But this diffusion did not necessarily involve the suppression of local cultural practices. Just as the Persian Achaemenid system had done, Hellenistic rulers often adopted and incorporated local traditions while simultaneously establishing Greek urban and civic structures in their domains. A city like Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great after his conquest of Egypt and subsequently developed by the Ptolemaic dynasty, exemplified this cultural synthesis. Alexandria was planned according to Greek urban principles and served as a center of Greek cultural life, yet it was also positioned as the capital of Egypt, and Ptolemaic rulers presented themselves as the heirs to the Egyptian pharaonic tradition, sponsoring Egyptian temples and maintaining Egyptian administrative traditions. This pattern repeated across the Hellenistic world. Greek urban centers coexisted with and often incorporated elements of local cultural traditions, creating a cosmopolitan pagan culture that maintained Greek forms while absorbing diverse local tradition. Creating a Creco-Culliton, Boyingor, Werns is going with bouncing born, with on. It is its in there, it is its squirt, but, it's where, but, wet, it hard, there. I would wet, well, up with to it, with war, with war, well, with war, as the word walk up, or was work with one that's the was born with the look to split up to the smoke that's the result was a remarkable historical moment in which Greek pagan civic systems served as the dominant template for urban organization across an enormous region, establishing patterns of city planning, market organization, and civic institutions that would shape Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The role of slavery within the broader framework of pagan civic systems demands careful analysis, as slavery was not incidental to ancient civilizations, but was deeply integrated into their economic and social structures. Throughout the ancient world, slavery existed in various forms and contexts. From household slaves who performed domestic labor, to agricultural slaves who worked state or private lands, to chattel slaves engaged in the most brutal and degrading forms of labor. In Greek and Roman contexts, slavery became increasingly central to economic organization, with large-scale agricultural production and many manufacturing activities depending heavily on enslaved labor. However, slavery's integration into pagan systems was not primarily a matter of spiritual justification, but of practical, economic, and social organization. The existence of slavery was justified through civic legal codes that defined different categories of persons: free citizens, resident foreigners, freed persons of various statuses, and the enslaved, and prescribed different rights and obligations for each category. The law codes of ancient civilizations, whether Babylonian, Egyptian, or Greek, explicitly recognized slavery as a legal status and defined the proper relationships between enslavers and the enslaved. The economic foundations of many ancient pagan civilizations rested partly on systems of dependent and enslaved labor organized through pagan civic institutions. In ancient Egypt, the state organized vast labor forces for irrigation, monument construction, and agricultural production, partly through systems of temporary servitude, in which debt or legal judgment could result in a person working state lands for a specified period. In Mesopotamian civilizations, similarly, debt slavery was common, with individuals who failed to repay debts becoming bound to work for their creditors. These systems of debt bondage were not merely economic mechanisms, but were embedded in pagan civic and legal frameworks that defined the terms of servitude, the conditions under which debt slavery could be imposed, and the circumstances under which enslaved persons could regain their liberty. The temple systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt incorporated enslaved labor into their vast economic operations, with temples employing enslaved persons in agricultural work, construction, and craft work as part of their administrative control of productive resources. The revenues generated through these labor systems supported the temples themselves and provided the surplus resources necessary for state administration, monumental construction, and the maintenance of priestly and bureaucratic classes. The systematic organization of warfare and conquest within pagan civilizations reveals how thoroughly integrated warfare had become into the civic and administrative frameworks of ancient societies. Warfare was not merely incidental conflict, but a structured institutional activity that occurred according to prescribed patterns and seasons determined by civic and agricultural calendars. Military campaigns typically occurred during specific seasons when agricultural labor demands were lower, allowing men to be mobilized for military service without destroying food production. The organization of armies required the mobilization of vast administrative systems to supply soldiers with food, weapons, and equipment, making warfare a major component of the overall administrative infrastructure of pagan states. Conquered territories provided tribute and slaves who were integrated into the conquering society's economic and social systems. This integration of warfare into civic systems means that slavery resulting from military conquest was not ancillary to the functioning of ancient civilizations, but was a direct consequence of systematic institutional warfare that was itself organized through pagan civic and administrative frameworks. The role of women within pagan civic systems varied significantly across different civilizations. But in all cases, women's participation in public civic life was severely restricted, while their roles within household economies and social reproduction were essential to the functioning of society. In Greek city-states, women's exclusion from public assembly, military service, and formal political participation meant they had no direct voice in the civic decisions that governed their lives. However, women's management of household economies, controlling food preparation, textile production, and the supervision of domestic slaves and servants made them essential to the economic functioning of elite households. Elite women's roles as wives of magistrates and as mothers of future citizens gave them significant informal influence, despite their formal exclusion from public institutions. In Rome, women enjoyed somewhat greater legal rights than in Greece, including the ability to own property and conduct certain forms of business independently. Yet they remained excluded from military service and formal political office. The legal status of women was fundamentally shaped by their relationship to male household heads, fathers, husbands, or male relatives, whose authority over them was established and reinforced through civic law. Women's participation in religious festivals and public ceremonies, where they often had designated roles distinct from male participation, provided occasions in which they could exercise some form of public presence, while simultaneously reinforcing their distinction from the male-centered civic sphere. The intellectual and artistic traditions that flourished within pagan civilizations were not separate from, but were deeply integrated into civic systems and public culture. The great philosophical schools of ancient Greece, the Academy of Plato, the Lyceum of Aristotle, the Stoic school were not isolated intellectual refuges, but were integrated into the civic life of their respective cities. Philosophy was taught and debated in public spaces, and philosophical ideas often addressed questions of direct civic relevance. What is justice? How should the state be organized? What obligations do citizens have to their communities? The dramatic festivals that produced the great tragedies and comedies that survived to the present day were not private entertainments, but public civic events in which entire communities participated. The painters and sculptors who created the remarkable artistic traditions of ancient Greece worked largely on civic commissions, creating sculptures for temples, painting civic monuments, or producing pottery vessels used in civic rituals and public life. The intellectual and artistic achievements of ancient civilization were not produced by isolated geniuses working independently, but were fostered by civic systems that sponsored intellectual inquiry, commissioned artistic works, and created social contexts in which intellectual and artistic excellence was valued and rewarded. The transition between different periods of pagan civilization and the gradual transformation of pagan civic systems over centuries reveals patterns of continuity and change that illuminate how these systems functioned as civilization-building frameworks. The adoption of Greek civic systems by the Hellenistic kingdoms, established after Alexander's conquests, was not a replacement of existing systems, but was an adaptation and modification of pre-existing patterns. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt following Alexander's conquest maintained Egyptian administrative traditions and sponsorship of Egyptian temples while simultaneously establishing Greek urban centers and adopting Greek cultural practices. The Seleucid Empire, that ruled over former Mesopotamian and Persian territories, similarly maintained existing administrative structures while establishing new Greek-style cities. This pattern demonstrates that pagan civic systems were flexible and adaptable, capable of incorporating new elements while maintaining fundamental continuities. The remarkable expansion of Greek civilization was successful not because it obliterated pre-existing cultures, but because Greek civic systems proved effective templates for urban organization and could be adapted to incorporate pre-existing institutions and practices. The material culture of daily life in ancient pagan civilizations reveals the pervasive presence of civic and religious themes in everyday objects and spaces. Pottery vessels used in households frequently bore scenes depicting civic or mythological themes. Architecture consistently incorporated elements that carried civic significance. Temples dominated urban skylines. Civic buildings were positioned in prominent locations. And even private dwellings frequently contained shrines or other elements connecting the household to the broader civic community. The layout of cities, with public spaces positioned for maximum visibility and impact, ensured that citizens encountered civic institutions and monuments constantly as they moved through urban space. This pervasive presence of civic and religious themes in the material environment created a context in which civic identity and participation in civic systems was understood as fundamental to the human condition. To live in a pagan city was to be constantly immersed in reminders of civic obligations, civic identity, and the structures through which civic life was organized. The longevity and geographical reach of pagan civic systems, demonstrated by their persistence across millennia and their adoption by diverse peoples throughout the ancient world, testifies to their fundamental effectiveness as frameworks for organizing human communities. These systems proved sufficiently flexible to be adapted to diverse geographical contexts. From the Mediterranean islands to the river valleys of the Near East to the deserts of Egypt, they proved capable of incorporating diverse populations with different linguistic traditions, prior cultural practices, and different relationships to state authority. They created mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion despite vast differences in wealth, power, and social status. They generated the resources necessary for remarkable technological achievements: aqueducts, roads, temples, defensive walls that demonstrated the community's collective power and inspired identification with the civic community. The fact that pagan civic systems persisted for thousands of years and were adopted and adapted by diverse civilizations across enormous geographical distances demonstrates that these systems answered genuine needs in human social organization. The festivals that brought communities together, the legal systems that adjudicated disputes, the bureaucratic systems that organized labor and resources, the artistic and intellectual traditions that conveyed civic values, Though these elements of pagan systems served practical functions in maintaining civilization and allowing complex urban societies to function effectively despite the absence of modern technological systems of communication and control. The comprehensive examination of pagan civic systems across multiple ancient civilizations reveals patterns of remarkable consistency in how these systems functioned as the foundational architecture of civilization itself. Whether in the city-states of Greece, the vast territories of the Roman Empire, the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the valley of the Nile, or the territories of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, pagan systems provided the essential mechanisms through which humans organized themselves into complex urban communities, maintained social cohesion across vast populations, and created the administrative infrastructure necessary for civilization to function. The true foundations of ancient civilization were not built upon abstract spiritual beliefs or mystical doctrines, but upon practical civic and social structures that addressed the tangible requirements of urban life and collective action. These structures functioned as operating systems of civilization, providing the procedural frameworks, social hierarchies, and institutional mechanisms through which ancient peoples created and sustained the most remarkable achievements of their era. The civic calendar constitutes perhaps the most fundamental element of pagan civilization's architectural design, revealing how thoroughly ancient societies understood the necessity of synchronized collective action. Every major civilization examined displayed a detailed and elaborate festival calendar that structured the entire year, determining when economic activities could occur, when legal proceedings were permitted, when military campaigns could be launched, and when communities gathered for collective celebration. The Greek festival calendar, the Roman liturgical year, the Egyptian festival cycle, and the Mesopotamian seasonal observances all served identical functions, despite their distinct specific forms. They created a temporal structure that allowed complex societies to coordinate the activities of millions of individuals without modern technological systems of communication. The festivals themselves were not voluntary entertainments, but mandatory publications that citizens and subjects were expected to attend, and participants and subjects and subjects is citizens and citizens, and according to parting courting is set it is setting to tore it to send it is sold it to send but it's it but it would make it good while it that with it there do to have it that was. And to it, what the war, the beautiful, the water, where to war, goes, that is go, what is that? The walk to at war, the walk the mortgage still was the was the coordination of activity that the civic calendar achieved through these festivals represented a remarkable technological accomplishment in social organization, allowing ancient civilizations to accomplish collective tasks, building monuments, conducting military campaigns, organizing trade, administering justice, that would have been impossible without the synchronized collective action that the calendar structure enabled. The temple institutions that dominated the urban landscapes of ancient civilizations functioned simultaneously as religious structures, administrative centers, economic powerhouses, and repositories of cultural knowledge. Temples were the buildings where sacrifices occurred, but they were also the places where state treasuries were stored, where skilled craftspeople trained apprentices, where administrative records were maintained, where markets operated, and where young people received their education in practical and cultural matters. The priesthoods that staffed these institutions were not separate from civic administration, but were integral components of the state administrative machinery. In Egypt, the priesthoods managed vast landed estates and controlled enormous portions of state resources. But this economic power was justified through their role in maintaining the cosmic order, through ritual performance, and in preserving the calendrical and astronomical knowledge necessary for agricultural planning. In Mesopotamia, Temples served as the organizing centers for labor mobilization and resource distribution, coordinating the construction of irrigation systems and other public works. In Rome, temples functioned as civic monuments and religious spaces, but were also integrated into the administrative structure of the state, with priests participating in political decisions and religious procedures, providing mechanisms through which political decisions were justified and legitimated. The integration of religious, administrative, and economic functions within temple institutions reveals how thoroughly pagan systems unified what modern societies conceptually separate into distinct institutional spheres. The legal systems of ancient pagan civilizations embodied the principles of pagan civic culture in explicit form, creating written codes that defined social relationships, prescribed punishments for violations of social norms, and established hierarchical relationships between different social categories. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, the Egyptian legal traditions preserved in papyrus documents, the Roman 12 tables and subsequent elaborations of Roman law, and the legal procedures evident in Greek city-state documents all reveal societies in which law was understood as a comprehensive system for organizing human relationships and maintaining social order. Critically, these legal systems explicitly recognized and perpetuated social hierarchies, establishing different legal statuses for different categories of persons and prescribing different rights and obligations depending on whether one was a free citizen, a resident foreigner, a freedent foreigner, a resident foreigner, a resident feigned, a resident, a freedent, fredent, a sludent, and it fur, it's insolent, it's rent, with that but, it's but, and but, where, if, and if they're dubbed, when we're to add to with that, to have to do with it for where, what to do, what, on, This systematic legal differentiation reveals that pagan civic systems did not create egalitarian societies, but rather created mechanisms through which hierarchical social orders could be maintained and perpetuated. The legal codes established procedures for adjudicating disputes, mechanisms for punishing violations of established norms, and frameworks within which economic transactions could occur with assured stability and predictability. The existence of such legal frameworks allowed economic specialization and trade to flourish, as merchants and craftspeople could conduct business with confidence that their agreements would be enforced and that disputes would be resolved through established procedures. The administrative bureaucracies that emerged within pagan civilizations to manage the complex operations of state apparatus represent among the most significant achievements of ancient civilization, creating systems of record-keeping, organizational hierarchy, and procedural oversight that allowed vast territories to be governed effectively. Thousands of surviving clay tablets, papyrus documents, and inscribed texts reveal detailed records of administrative transactions, assignments of labor, collection of taxes, allocation of resources, and execution of public works projects. These records demonstrate the existence of sophisticated systems for verifying the accuracy of administrative reports, auditing the conduct of officials, and maintaining organized archives that preserved institutional memory across generations. The scribal professions that maintained these administrative systems formed crucial professional classes, individuals whose specialized knowledge and training gave them status and authority. The training of scribes involved years of formal education in writing systems, mathematical calculation, legal procedures, and administrative protocols, creating a professional class whose expertise allowed them to serve as intermediaries between elite leaders and the broader population. The sophistication of ancient administrative systems is particularly remarkable given that they operated without transportation or informated with wardens, rensomores, transportation, resporcitation, relying in stenants, instewards, instacord, instacorns, carns, cord, insport, and ritsport, and core, dude, and repot, in word, or in, with, it, but, it's it that then. with well what I want well dog well what to well what to which the store discusses to go course to this the system this was the artistic and intellectual traditions that flourished within pagan civilizations were not incidental to their functioning, but were integral to how these civilizations maintained their identity and transmitted cultural values. The dramatic festivals of Athens produced the great tragedies and comedies that addressed civic questions of governance, justice, and human obligation. The sculptural programs of temples and civic buildings conveyed narratives of collective achievement and embodied civic values in permanent visual form. The pottery tradition of Greece, the architectural achievements of Rome, and the monumental sculpture of Egypt all served to create visual environments that constantly reminded inhabitants of the community's achievements and their own place within the civic hierarchy. Intellectual traditions from natural philosophy in Greece to rhetorical training in Rome addressed questions directly relevant to civic life and prepared individuals for participation in civic institutions. The preservation and transmission of literary works through copying and recopying ensured that the cultural values and historical narratives they embodied persisted and shaped subsequent generations' understanding of their civilization. The expansion of pagan civic systems across vast geographical distances and their adoption by diverse peoples demonstrates their fundamental effectiveness as frameworks for organizing human communities and maintaining social cohesion. The Greek polis model was adapted from the Aegean Islands to colonial settlements throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. The Roman civic system expanded from the Italian peninsula to encompass most of Europe, North Africa, and much of the Near East. The Persian administrative system incorporated conquered territories into an imperial framework while preserving many pre-existing administrative traditions and local practices. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's conquests adapted Greek civic models to new territories while incorporating elements of local administrative traditions. This repeated pattern of expansion and adaptation reveals that pagan civic systems were sufficiently flexible to be applied in diverse contexts, yet sufficiently robust to maintain their fundamental character across geographical and cultural distance. The transitions between different periods of ancient civilization and the gradual transformations of pagan civic systems over the centuries reveal patterns that illuminate how resilient these systems were and how resistant they were to fundamental change. The shift from Greek independence to incorporation within Hellenistic kingdoms to subordination within the Roman Empire did not eliminate Greek civic institutions, but rather adapted them to new political circumstances. The Roman transformation from republic to empire involved significant changes in political institutions and procedures, yet maintained many of the underlying pagan civic structures that had characterized Roman civilization from its origins. Temples continued to function as civic centers, festivals continued to structure the calendar year, legal procedures continued to be justified through reference to traditional principles, and the civic hierarchy that organized society continued, contingent society continues, Solagis Archines Sudwed Sapacho, it is Sadlik, it is Sapless, do it is that, it is so it's it, but, and to put the like what to the fact The persistence of pagan civic systems, despite massive political upheavals, suggests that these systems answered genuine and persistent requirements in how humans organize themselves into complex communities. The material culture that surrounded inhabitants of ancient pagan civilizations created physical environments in which civic identity and participation in civic systems were constantly reinforced. The architecture of cities' temples, dominating skylines, civic buildings positioned prominently, marketplaces designed for efficient conduct of commerce, streets laid out according to rational principles created visual environments that embodied civic values and expressed the community's collective power. The artworks with which cities were decorated, sculptural programs on temples, painted scenes on pottery, mosaics on public buildings, conveyed civic narratives and expressed cultural values. The scale and magnificence of public monuments testified to the community's collective ability to accomplish remarkable projects, creating a source of collective pride and identification. Citizens moving through their cities encountered constant reminders of the institutions that organized their society, the hierarchy within which they held their position, and the expectations that their civic role imposed upon them. This pervasive presence of civic themes in the built environment meant that one could not move through a pagan city without confronting the civic system that structured urban life. The integration of warfare into the broader framework of pagan civic systems reveals how thoroughly these systems encompassed all dimensions of collective life, including the most destructive and violent. Military campaigns were not incidental to ancient civilization, but were fundamental mechanisms through which states expanded their territories, acquired resources, and enslaved persons to incorporate into their economies, and maintained the dominance that allowed existing power structures to persist. The organization of warfare required mobilizing vast administrative systems to supply armies with food, equipment, and materials. The commemoration of military victories through triumphal processions, monuments, and historical narratives integrated warfare into the civic memory and collective identity of communities. Successful military commanders became objects of commemoration and remembrance, with statues erected in their honor and their achievements recounted in literary and artistic works. The inclusion of warfare so thoroughly within civic systems means that conquest and domination were not external to ancient civilization, but were built into the fundamental structures through which ancient societies organized themselves. The legacy of pagan civic systems extends far beyond the ancient world, as the administrative procedures, legal principles, architectural forms, and cultural practices that developed within ancient pagan civilizations have profoundly influenced all subsequent human civilization. The Roman legal tradition, transmitted through the Justinian compilation and subsequent medieval transmission, became the foundation for the legal systems of most European nations. Roman administrative procedures and concepts of civic authority influenced the development of subsequent states and empires. The Greek philosophical traditions that emerged within ancient pagan civic contexts continued to shape intellectual inquiry throughout subsequent history. The architectural forms and urban planning principles developed in ancient civilizations influenced subsequent architectural and urban traditions. The festival traditions and public ceremonies that characterized ancient pagan civilization influenced the development of subsequent public celebrations and civic rituals. Even the fundamental principle that societies require elaborate calendrical systems, structured public ceremonies, and institutional frameworks through which collective action is coordinated principles embedded in pagan civic systems remain relevant to modern societies. The transformation of pagan civic systems in late antiquity, and the eventual emergence of different religious and political systems did not involve the wholesale destruction or abandonment of pagan civic structures, but rather involved their gradual transformation and adaptation to new circumstances. Urban centers that had developed according to pagan civic principles remained functioning cities, with temples sometimes being converted to new uses, civic spaces being repurposed while maintaining their essential character, and administrative procedures continuing to function according to patterns established centuries earlier. The transition involved the gradual modification rather than the sudden replacement of pagan systems, a process that extended across centuries and that involved continuous negotiation and adaptation. The very fact that the transition was gradual and involved adaptation rather than wholesale replacement suggests the robustness of pagan civic systems and their ability to accommodate significant change while maintaining essential continuities. The examination of pagan civic systems across the full span of ancient civilizations reveals that the true foundations of civilization were constructed not through the imposition of spiritual or religious doctrines, but through the creation of practical institutional frameworks that addressed the tangible requirements of human social organization. The festivals that brought communities together created occasions for collective action and the renewal of social bonds. The temples that dominated urban landscapes functioned as administrative centers, repositories of knowledge, and focal points for community identity. The legal systems that defined social relationships and prescribed punishments for violations created frameworks within which human interaction could occur with predictable consequences. The bureaucratic procedures through which resources were allocated and labor was organized allowed vast undertakings to be accomplished through coordinated collective effort. The artistic and intellectual traditions that flourished within pagan civilizations created cultural forms through which communities understood themselves and transmitted their values across generations. The carefully constructed hierarchies of status and authority that pagan systems maintained provided frameworks through which power could be legitimated and exercised. These institutional mechanisms and social frameworks constituted the essential infrastructure through which ancient peoples created and sustained civilization, demonstrating that civilization itself rests upon foundations of civic and social organization rather than upon abstract belief or spiritual conviction. The remarkable achievements of ancient pagan civilizations, the aqueducts and roads of Rome, the temples of Greece and Egypt, the art and literature that continue to inspire in the present day, the philosophical traditions that continue to shape intellectual inquiry, the legal principles that continue to govern modern societies were not produced by mystical or spiritual forces, but by millions of individuals whose activities were coordinated through the civic systems that structured their communities. The ability of ancient societies to accomplish such remarkable achievements, despite the absence of modern technology, testifies to the effectiveness of pagan civic systems as mechanisms for coordinating collective human action and maintaining social cohesion. The festivals that mobilized entire cities to participate in celebration and ritual, the administrative systems that tracked and coordinated the movement of resources across vast territories, the legal systems that allowed commerce and civil dispute to occur within predictable frameworks, the educational systems that trained successive generations in the skills and knowledge necessary for civic participation. All these pagan civical knowledge, these pagan civilizations, to function effectively and to accomplish remarkable collectively Understanding the true foundations of ancient civilization requires recognizing that civilization rests not upon transcendent spiritual, but upon the practical civic and solitules not appordinates, intordinates a particle, and solidical, and solignates, and solidens collecticals, intagens coegens, entains collections, intancorns, and coordins, and coordins cord, and cord, to it, board, court, port, bar, cuppa, it's there, or, and or, when we're, or, and with, and with that thou is, with how, do, with the course, wish book, with work, The pagan foundations of ancient civilization were, in essence, the foundations of human civilization itself, the institutional, social, and cultural frameworks through which human beings have consistently organized themselves into complex communities and created the conditions under which remarkable achievements become possible.